Okay, a bit of a different video this time, and this is less so a case study and more so a universal topic that can be applied to any athlete that fits this demographic. Um, and that topic is essentially deviating from the typical 1 week long microcycle. I coach someone right now, my client Brendan, who we actually run a 2 week microcycle with. And I will preface this video saying microcycle in this case is a bit subjective, and I guess you can kind of call what we're doing a week-long microcycle that alternates every other week. It's a bit complicated, but the way we have it organized is in the fashion of a 2 week microcycle. Um, so I will explain that a bit more when I get the visual up. Um, I will also preface this video by saying I would say 9 times out of 10, the most predictable way to orient someone's training is within a week-long microcycle that repeats within a certain block, that repeats within a certain macrocycle, and so on. But for Brendan, we tried that within his current work schedule, and it just did not seem to work, and we had to make some adjustments along the way. The reason it didn't work is because of Brendan's work schedule, and this is why I said this can kind of be universally applied, but it needs to be applied only when necessary, in my opinion. And like I said, 9 times out of 10, I think sticking to 1 week of training that repeats and has certain dynamic components like RPE and load progression um, is usually the best way to go and how to get training to be the most predictable. Because, for example, say someone squats twice a week on Monday and Thursday, we have probably a very, very similar workout on every single Monday and Thursday of the week. And again, that's a whole topic for a new video. But in short, it's the best way to make things the most predictable and consistent over time to repeat a certain system that we know works for a given athlete. In Brandon's case, he has a very odd work schedule, and I'm not going to show his exact work schedule because that's his information, obviously. But off the top of my head, it alternates every other week. So if you view his work schedule as if he has 2 weeks, that first week he works a certain amount of days per week that's consistent during that week. Then the next week it's the same thing, but it's different than the first week. So again, I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's for example, like say during that first week he'll work like Monday through Wednesday and then Saturday or something, and then the following week it'll be like Tuesday through Thursday and Sunday, something like that. That's obviously not exactly what it is because I'm not gonna say that in its entirety in this video, but that is the gist. And like I mentioned, we tried to orient a week-long microcycle, for lack of a better term. Again, you can kind of call this a week-long microcycle, just different every other week, but we tried to orient it around his work schedule because I was very convinced that that was the way we could do it, but it resulted in a lot of sleepless nights, training that was getting more impacted by work and external variables than we would like, things of that nature. So we did end up agreeing on running this alternating microcycle, 2 week microcycle, whatever you want to call it. So I will get into the detail of how we did that. So like I mentioned, I'm not really going to run through the nuances and the details of what his exact schedule looks like because I'm not entirely sure that that is super relevant to the point I'm trying to make here. More so the theme of this video is that a microcycle does not have to be 1 week. There are ways to get creative with things where athletes are going to have these odd work schedules, like in Brendan's case, a work schedule that alternates every other week, and you can work training around it for the athlete's needs. Something I like to bring up when I start to coach new athletes is that I personally very much so prioritize organizing training around someone's life outside the gym. Most people are not going to have powerlifting be that number one priority. But frankly, even if they do, cases where powerlifting is, go, go, go for athletes, days where someone's, work or school or life schedule is filled to the max, they're probably not going to have the most productive session after, let alone are these athletes going to, be the most productive in terms of time management to get a certain session in. For example, maybe someone is in college and works full time. They go to school, they work, and then it's 8 or 9 p.m. and they have primary bench and deadlift and three accessories, that session is probably going to suffer a little bit. Again, long story short is trying to organize training around an athlete's schedule outside of the gym as best as we possibly can. There are obviously going to be cases in certain sessions, in certain weeks, blocks, whatever, that it's not going to fit perfectly. And I'll get to that for the sessions here that don't fit perfectly, because this microcycle design for Brendan does not work perfectly. But what the goal is to get things to work the best that we can. So I'll get into the exact microcycle design, which is what we have laid out here at the top. And again, you can view this as like a 1 week microcycle that alternates every other week. But the way I mentally view it is that this is a 2-week microcycle that repeats twice per block. So a quick tidbit that I do want to add is we have to run even number weeks per block for Brendan, because again, he has an alternating work schedule, and if we want both weeks, or this 2-week microcycle, whatever you want to call it, to line up appropriately with his work schedule, we can't be running something like a 5-week block or a 3-week block, because it's going to oddly rotate every block, and it's not going to line up with the schedule. So that is a bit of a drawback here. Fortunately, we found that 4-week blocks are a little bit of a sweet spot for Brendan and a good way for us to manage that. But if we do ever want to have some kind of a deload period or add an intro week on top of a block, it needs to be very convenient. Like, for example, this block right here, this is a little bit of an aside from the video. Let me try to get this back here. There we go. But this was a 2-week period that we ran before Brendan went on vacation for 1 week. So then we had the opportunity to run this 4-week block with an intro week. Fortunately, because he had that 1 week long vacation, and then he resumed on his normal work schedule after that. So that was a bit of an oddball, but for the most part, we are somewhat constrained to running even number week blocks for him, which is fine. It's just a little bit of a downside. So the way we have things organized is, like I said, within some kind of a 2-week layout that alternates. Brendan's, we can just call it day 1, I guess, is a rest day. That Monday to start the block is going to be a secondary squat and bench. And then you can kind of see from there's not really something that adds up week to week. The only lift that is consistent week to week is benched. You can see he benches on Monday and Friday every week. He only benches 2 times a week. He's actually the only person I coach who benches 2 times a week. But bench is the only thing that we have coincidentally got to line up as consistently as we do. So that being said, his squat and deadlift sessions per week are on different days. The biggest obstacle that we need to account for here is just the overlap between the two. So, for example, this is a 6-day period. Well, I guess you can call it 7-day, more of a 6-day period though, where he's technically squatting 3 days in a week, which I don't really want. And I'll get to how we're adjusting that in a second. And this deadlift period here, he's also technically deadlifting 3 days in a week being a 7-day period, obviously. But that's not something we want. And you might be thinking to yourself, why I have things organized this way? Trust me, this is what we have found to be the best possible way to organize his training with his work schedule. Again, I'm not going to put his work schedule on the screen, but it alternates and it's very abnormal. So we're just trying to get things organized the best that we possibly can and reduce overlap between squat and deadlift. So another bit of strategy that I have implemented here when organizing this 2-week microcycle is that, so we're going to be, I'll actually zoom out so you can see this a bit better. This week 1 and week 3 are the same, and this week 2 and week 4 are the same. Therefore, this week 4 is going to be kind of that heaviest week of the block, right? So going back up here, this part that I'm highlighting right now, the second time the second half of this microcycle repeats, that's going to be the heaviest week of his block. So the way we have things organized is with this little bit of an oddball and frequency and managing the overlap between squat and deadlift. The number one thing I want is to maximize rest period between the lifts going into specifically that week 4. So if we think about it, that week 2 and week 4, he's probably going to be feeling a little bit better than weeks 1 and 3. For a bit of context, Brennan is a 125 kilo male-ish, and he is very intensity sensitive. He does really well with these gigantic jumps per week, and just lower frequency with lower average intensity secondary session on squat and deadlift. Same deal for bench. You can see he only benches twice a week, and we found that works great for him. And the reason I bring that up is because if, say, he was a bit on the opposite end of that demographic, say a lightweight female who responds well to high average intensity throughout the week and higher frequency, this would be a bit of a different story. But for Brendan, we're really trying to get this Wednesday and Friday of that week 4 towards the second half of that microcycle to show up really strong and really recovered, because he shows up strong when he's recovered. And that week 4 at this point is beyond predictable, which is a good thing. So I'll get into how we have oriented things around training with all of that considered. So let's start with squat. Like I mentioned, he squats on Monday, Friday during the first half, and then Sunday, Wednesday during that second half. So in theory, we're trying to get this Wednesday on week 4 to show up the strongest. So in theory, that week 2 and week 4 are the best feeling squat days for him. So for example, his week 1 secondary session is just 2x6 high bar with a 2x6 paused high bar after that. So just 4 sets of 6 on high bar squat, which is very easy for him. Brendan squats 600 pounds and he's taking week 1 set of 6 at 370 pounds. So again, you can see the theme with these big jumps. The next week, that secondary squat is getting done on Sunday, and our strategy here, with again, knowing that there's going to be technically what's a little bit of an increase in frequency every other week here, because again, this part I'm highlighting is technically 3 times squat in 7 days. This week 2 and week 4 on that secondary day, we have that pulled back a bit. So he only has 1 set of 6 here, and then 2x6 high bar. I think the intensity, the percentage drop here is a bit greater than the week prior to get a little bit less weight on the bar. But you can see he's only got 75% of the workload relative to the previous week. Yes, he's taking a bit higher on the range and the RPE, but still, this is more so just understanding that the time between that secondary and primary day for week 2 is lesser than week 1, and then same thing for week 3 and 4. So going into that week 3, he's going to have pretty much a repeat of that week 1 session, just a little bit more, right? Having that full 4 sets here. To kind of get a little bit more stimulus under his belt, because he has that longer timing of exposure between that secondary and primary session. And then for his final secondary block, he's going to have in between 400 and 420 on the bar at a 5 RPE. And again, back to 3 sets and a little bit shaved off the average intensity for this 2x6 pause for back off sets. So the reason we're doing that is, again, just with the difference in rate of exposure, or to the timing of exposure rather, to get that primary day to show up strong. And I'll show you guys what that primary day looks like working backwards. So I'll actually reference the previous block because that's already completed. So for example, he took a squat PR triple at 545 pounds on that week 4. And the week prior, he did his primary squat technically 5 days before that. So again, just making sure that RPE on this day does not get too high, because then he's going to have to do this exact same primary session 5 days later. So if we're overexerting ourselves here, specifically on weeks 1 and 3, the week 2 and 4 is really, really going to suffer. So understanding that RPE might need to be limited a bit more here relative to where I would have it otherwise, as well as having every other secondary squat session be ticked down a bit lighter. So again, you can kind of view this as what I like to call a 2-week microcycle, as I've mentioned, but more so just alternating the placement of sessions every other week, as well as the intensity distribution within those sessions. So you can see RP is a bit lighter. Continuing to work backwards on week 2, we have pretty much where I would have his week 2 at. Otherwise, if we were to hypothetically squat on the same day every week, this was still super easy. And then going into that week 1, this was, again, the block that we had that intro week, so there is a 5th week here, but that week 1 is, again, just playing it a little bit more on the conservative side, so he's not just gassing himself out immediately within that technical 3-time-a-week squat frequency. So what we have organized out for deadlift is referring back to where his demographic sits. Brendan really, really does not need a high-intensity secondary session on squat or deadlift. He just needs a secondary session in general just to get the bar moving and get that skill practice in. So what we have him doing and what we found works phenomenally for him is really just hardly anything. Where we have a very, very easy percentage-based pause set of 5 on deadlift, and I just keep it within like a 10 to 15 pound kind of range throughout the block, and I write the number in for him. I pick that number already. And then a very easy set of 8 on RDL. You can see he's rating both of these at RP0. And fortunately, the way I have these organized, they're within the same day. So he's got it on either Monday or Tuesday. It's not as wide of a distribution as those primary squat, that primary and secondary squat sessions are, mainly that primary squat, because that's the one that fluctuates the most every other week. So you can see pretty similar secondary session. We're keeping that RDL set the exact same, and it's really just there, adding 5-ish to 10 pounds on that pause set of 5 on deadlift. And then same deal for that final week of the block. We're just letting that secondary day really just be a secondary day. We're not really trying to prime anything, so it doesn't need to be as high intensity as it would be otherwise. And then he comes into this primary deadlift, which is on Friday on week 2 and 4, and then on week 1 and 3, he's going to have that primary session on Saturday. So again, another thing to keep in mind, because again, we're really trying to work through the relationship between squat and deadlift here, because bench is just kind of doing its own thing on its own days on Monday and Friday. Is on every week 1 and 3, that primary deadlift is going to be on Saturday, which is going to be significantly closer to that primary squat session than it would be on week 2 and 4. So for example, week 1, he'll have that primary deadlift on Saturday, and then he hits that primary squat on Wednesday, whereas otherwise, he's going to be taking, say, a week 2 primary deadlift on Friday, and then coming into a week 3 primary squat on Friday. So it's going to be a full week in between those primary sessions. So again, we're trying to really balance out the intensity distribution and the timing of exposure between squat and deadlift, mainly on those primary days, to get things to show up as reasonably week to week as we possibly can. So like I mentioned, with alternating RPE and just playing things a little bit more conservative every other week on squat, like I mentioned, we're trying to keep this week 1 and 3 primary squat a little bit more conservative relative to weeks 2 and 4, because it's 2 days before the secondary squat and puts us technically at a 3-time frequency. We're going to be doing something a bit similar with that primary session on deadlift, where for Brendan, it's more of weeks 1 through 3 are decently easy, and then week 4 is a bit more of that ball out, and he can have a little bit more of that big bang to end the block. So technically what I prescribe is a fairly normal RPE progression for him on deadlift, but I really just keep things, just emphasize that we don't need to push. Like week 3 to 4, I only have him at an RP7, where typically we end things around like an 8.5 to 9 for him. So again, a bigger RPE jump specifically from week 3 to 4, where you can see the week prior is only a 6.5. So I think we're going from pretty decent jump here from week 1 to 2, just to make sure that week 1's light enough. Then week 2 and 3 is going to be pretty similar in intensity, right? Going 6.5 RPE, 7 RPE to the next week, and then I have them all the way to a 9 RPE on that following week. So it doesn't necessarily need to be this linear progression and even jumps per week to get things to show up as they need to. In Brendan's case, it really is just managing the overlap between squat and deadlift. And then I'll run through bench really quick, but for Brendan, he has a super simple layout. His secondary session is just a tempo single, right now at least. Actually, I'll reference his current block because it's slightly different now. He has a tempo single with 2 RPE-based sets of 4 and then 2 percentage-based sets of 6. And going all the way down to his primary bench, which again is every week on Friday, he will have a single into an RPE-based double, another double, and a 2x5. That's all percentage-based. So what the one caveat is for him is we actually do dumbbell press on top of that. And that actually somewhat serves as a third bench day every other week. Let me see if I can find a good example where on Wednesday, so every week 2 and 4, he will have that dumbbell press on a day that he's essentially not benching, right? Whereas every week 1 and 3, that dumbbell press is going to be placed on every primary bench session. And what we've kind of toyed with is just keeping that that dumbbell bench every Friday. But there's 2 things to consider. We've been doing this general 2-week length into microcycle for Brendan for quite some time now. It's been over half a year, and it's working fantastic. And that was the original design that we organized, and Bench is making awesome progress. So we do not need to change it just for the sake of experimenting with that. That's the first reason. Um, and the second reason is, like I said, it kind of fuels that somewhat of a third bench day. So I'm not entirely sure as if this week 4 primary bench would come in as strong as if we were to have that dumbbell press consistently on Friday every time, versus what we do here with having it be on Friday and then Wednesday and then Friday and then on Wednesday. And then another additional reason is also just session length, and that goes back to what I initially said, right? Because session length is something that was a bit tricky to account for with this bit of a unique layout, where that's the main reason why I had that dumbbell press in a different location each week, just to account for session length, to make sure he wasn't going to be at the gym 3 hours twice a week or something of that nature. So bench, again, secondary and primary days were pretty easy to program. They were the same every single week and they're on the same sessions. But it was that dumbbell press, I think he has 3 sets total, that we needed to account for with session length. It's been going really well so far, so we haven't needed to change anything. And frankly, it serves a little bit as like a bridging the gap for bench every other week. And so far, it's working great. That just about wraps up what I wanted to run through and cover. Again, this is kind of a case study video for Brendan, how we organize his training every block. But more so just to emphasize that a microcycle does not need to be this 1 week of training that repeats every single week, let alone doesn't need to be 1 week of training. And like I mentioned in the introductory clip for this video, I do highly recommend having that week of training that repeats every week, and is just, in my opinion, the best way to establish consistency and predictability within someone's life schedule, and also just within the gym and in training in general. But it does not always need to be the case, and there's a lot of very basic and, I don't want to say trendy, but very modern concepts in powerlifting that a lot of coaches feel like they need to apply, or else they're doing something incorrectly. And like I mentioned, that's really the point I'm trying to sell home here, is you can deviate from the norm and have it be just as productive as otherwise. So don't be afraid to toy around with the general structure of things and the design of someone's microcycle. In Brennan's case, obviously, it's very unique. And deviate from the norm, because there is not always a one-size-fits-all for people, especially with powerlifters who have this odd work schedule or life schedule or school schedule, whatever it is. Because also, like I mentioned in that introductory clip, I personally am very big on organizing someone's training around their life to get the most productive result possible. So again, you can kind of view this as a little bit of a Brendan case study, but in short, it's more of a how to organize things around someone's odd schedule and experiment with microcycle length and the allocation of how that's programmed every other week in this case. So yeah, thanks for watching. Really enjoyed making this one. And if you have any questions or anything you wanted to add about the video, feel free to drop a comment.